Cool. All right, for people watching the video, all we've done so far is um, scaffolded a project using Candyman. We have our root route here, which gets scaffolded by Candyman, and all we did was create a post route of create, which leverages our DB connector class, which we've just copy and pasted directly from the platform, and then configured this a little bit. Is that enough for me? Okay, cool. Awesome. So we've built this query string, and hopefully we'll execute this query string. And then we'll redirect to index. So we've saved, started up our server. So coming back here, refresh. Donovan, I love C#. Submit. Oh, I knew it. Something's wrong. Let's take a look.
Put a string.
Huh?
Around your name and contact.
Good call. Is that what you were talking about with the single quote stuff?
No. Like if you do single on the outside, double, and then plus, it'll work.
Yes.
But
Yes.
date time might just be now, right?
What?
Maybe it does.
Needs to be in a string?
I've always used just now.
I don't want to stringify it because what's being accepted in my DB is should be type datetime.
Because still accept the value as a string. In the daytime format.
I think you're right, Monday. This is why ORMs are great, guys. Don't have to do this. Yay, thanks, Monday. You just have to put single quotes around your values because it accepts it as a string and then converts it to datetime as it saves. So if we take a look at our MySQL database, and then if we select off from quotes, perfect, it's been added. Oh wait, our datetime didn't save.
Isn't it just now?
I have now. Oh, is it just now?
Just now. Yeah, I don't think you need to do. I do now all caps.
Yeah, for SQL. In that case, then you don't need the string.
Now does not exist.
Oh,
Yeah, just as
now function.
just as now.
As a function.
without the curly brackets.
Oh, like this?
Invoked function.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, good job, guys. Awesome. I know, right? Okay, cool. So we're interacting with our database. We are saving stuff. Our controllers are working. Our views are working. Everything's great. You guys now have everything you need to complete this assignment, right? Great. So what's the problem, though? Or what do you think could be a potential problem? Let's say if I deployed this application and people were interacting with my program, adding awesome quotes. A potential risk. Validations for sure, yeah, but not with maybe like the code of my program, but the way that it's configured. Maybe someone who's read ahead might know what I'm thinking at because I know that question's a little vague. It has to do with security. My dbconnection.cs class it has all of the information in regards to what it has my username, it has my password, it has what port I'm using. Like if someone were to just kind of look into my source code on GitHub, they could just totally drop all my tables or scalp all of the data from my database just by like using these login credentials, right? Very dangerous. So there is a lot of configuring we have to do in order to secure this from the public. And really all we have to do, kind of in a simplistic version, is to create a different JSON file that we incorporate into our startup.cs and then just not deploy that file. So if you guys know what git ignores are, or maybe some versions of git ignores, basically what you put in that git ignore file does not get shipped out when you commit or push to your repo. So it gets held back. So that's what we need to do. It's a very long process and a little bit confusing, so we'll go through this together. So if you go to securing connection strings, there is a lot of really good info. It doesn't just tell you all of these code snippets to copy and paste. It kind of explains what each line is doing, which I know for people like Monday and like myself too, I love to know what's happening. So definitely read these and go in and Google stuff if things are still unclear, but we'll do that together real quick. So we need to create another JSON file, and we'll just call it app settings. I'm going to close this real quick. Give myself some room. Nope. New file. And you can see that it's just a JSON object. It has a key pair value of DB info, with the value being this object, and it has a key pair value in here, name, MySQL Connect, connection string, and that's basically all this information we have here in this string, right? So again, you do have to configure this. So I'll call it quotes. Change your username, password, your ports, whatever else you need to. For me, all I need to just do is change that DB name, quotes. Cool. That's what I wanted to avoid. Does that mean it stopped?
Well,
Are we good? We're good. We're good. Where was I? Okay, cool. So we have this app settings.json file. So what we need to do is tell our project.json to look at our app settings.json. And what we need to do is to have this configure extensions dependency. What is going on? So in my project.json, I need to include Microsoft extensions.options.configure extensions because I'm going to be extending this app settings.json. Restore. Cool. And in our startup, yes, we'll need to create a constructor class. We needed some using statements here. But you can see that this is just a constructor class that gets run upon instantiation of the startup, which means to say that anytime a project runs or gets created, this constructor method will run. So we need some using statements here, using statement here. Cool. And these dot statements build our builder variable, and what it's telling us to do is look into our app settings.json folder. And then we're going to interact, and we're going to pull this connection string out of it in just 1 second. Cool. So in our startup, we need to add another service. And can someone remind me again what a service is? Anybody? It's a service that you use that's more important in terms of what's more important is the scope of the accessibility of these services. They're available to us all across our application, right? Cool. So we're going to add this configuration of MySQL options as a service. So what is MySQL options? It looks like it's some type of class, and you're absolutely right. So what we need to do is create a MySQL options class. So let's see. And by convention, it's in a properties folder. And we're going to call this MySQL options. Cool.
Is space space?
It is. I'm not sure. C# is the most forgiving language with case sensitivity. Like, it doesn't matter a lot of times. So I'm not too sure before I answer that question.
Candyman, whatever you name your product directory is going to be a namespace.
Yes.
So you just make it whatever you do.
Yeah. Or you can change your namespace, though. I assume it's create Candyman. Yeah. What the heck? Okay. I think we're good. Cool. So what we're doing, or what we're enabling here, if we go back to our startup, everything should be good, is we're using something called dependency injection. Does anyone know what dependency injection is?
So basically, it's like the object gets created outside of the thing that needs it. So the thing that needs it doesn't create it. It gets created and then gets used.
Yes. I think that's what's happening. Yes, you're right. If I'm understanding
Something
correctly.
else creates the object
But-
for you, and you can use it. Instead of you worrying about creating an object. So if you need, for example, if you need like that, that ASP.NET service or whatnot, that doesn't get created. You don't have to worry about creating it. It's created for you outside of your app, and then you just use it like you were doing use whatever. You just use whatever you want out of that once it's been created.
Kind of. It's still created inside your application, and the .usings are different, a little bit different than the services that we enable. But through dependency injection, which allows us to scope it across our entire application, we now have access to our app settings.json string that we created. So this connection string in our app settings.json. So this enables us to actually call on this settings.json string and enable it. Kind of exactly like what we did here. So eventually what we're going to do is get rid of all of this because we don't want it shown, right? So I'll just get rid of it now and then we'll see what we can do. Where was I? Cool. So we've added our constructor function. We've enabled our service. So, we have our MySQL options.cs. So now what we do is now add this to our DB connector. We need to use this. So we create a MySQL config variable, and then we set in MySQL config our config variable that gets instantiated in our iOptions MySQL options. So okay, we'll move on for now. I'll come back to this. But you can see, once I get rid of these statics, they're no longer static. But you can see that I got rid of my all of my app settings, and now I'm pulling them in from app settings. So you might be wondering, where are these iOptions, MySQL options, config? Where are all of these things coming from, and how are they accessible? And that's through dependency injection through the services that we enabled, and that's kind of how they're accessible to us here, and why we can call on them. Cool. Okay. So all of this should remain the same, except you do have to remove the statics because they're not instantiable. Cool. And then we're gonna add DB connector here to our startup.cs. Dylan, cool. And you'll see what we're doing. Question?
Because I kind of got caught up on the placement of the section before. Does it matter the order of services?
I don't think so. Yeah, I could be wrong, but
Because
as far as I've experienced, it shouldn't.
it matters for app, though, right?
It does.
Like session has to be above MVC.
It does.
Okay.
Yes. Cool. So we're scoping this DB connector class so that we have we can now reach in and grab our DB connector class from our quotes controller. So you'll see that what we do here is pretty simple. DB in my get rid of all of this. In my quotes controller, I create a private read-only variable called underscore DB connector, right? Which is type what? DB connector, which I've scoped across through a service. And then inside this private variable, I just create an instance of an actual DB connector. So now, instead of having, kind of if you guys remember what my project looked like before, where all of this was just globally accessible to me and I could just call on the DB connector class, what I'm doing is I'm instantiating that class in a private variable up here of DB connector so no one else can access it, and now I can internally with underscore DB connector. So if everything is good and dandy with all of the changes that I made, everything should run exactly the same way. So my app is secure. And then if we check our DB, select off from quotes, and there we go. It's in there, and all of my DB connection configurations are hidden away in my app settings.json file, which I will not deploy.
Where does that controller quote controller gets created?
Where?
Yeah, where does the instance get created?
The instance of our quotes controller?
Yeah.
When our project gets run. It's the .mvc build portion.
And how does it know to pass in that DB connector?
Pass
How does it know to use that constructor for that?
this constructor?
Yeah.
Because it's the only constructor that we have.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
You're
it
talking
knows-
about like method overloading?
No, and then it knows that through the service that we created to pass in the DB connector instance to our controller when it gets created.
Yeah, because it's scoped globally, so if we pass something into it, it'll exist. Yeah. Cool. So that was kind of the hard part, is configuring all of the private settings and creating this app settings.json, going back and touching all of these startup.cs services and whatnot, and creating this startup constructor method. But once we have all of this enabled, we're pretty much good to go from here on out. We can now start incorporating some models. So at this point, so we talked briefly in lecture this morning, or before we kind of jumped over here, the purpose of models, right? They're just classes that we instantiate and that we can save those instances into our DB. So if we take a look at our models, it's very similar to kind of the OOP classes that we were creating. Well, that's exactly what they are, right? So instead of just pulling each variable back from the form, what we can do is leverage the power of OOP. New folder, call it models, and here we'll have a new file called quote.cs. And in quote.cs, we can define what our constructor is going to be, or what our class is going to be, quotes. Cool. So our quote has a name, it has contents, and it has a date time. Yes? That's type. Or no, created at. That's type, date, time. Probably need to use system. Cool. Perfect. So now we have this quote class here. Instead of building our query string like this, what we can do is build our new, so type quote of new quote equals a new quote. And we can use models. What is this? Oh,
Space.
sorry. Quote new quote equals a new quote. And what we can do is build our new quote object. So what attributes does our new quote instance have?
Name.
Name equals the name that we got back. Oops. Contents equals the contents that we got back. Cool. And since datetime is going to be created whenever our object gets created, how about we build a constructor function here where create at gets set to datetime. Cool. So I have this new quote object now, right? So what I can do is add new quote.name and add new quote.contents. Now, why we incorporated this model and we're kind of building out this structure here, a lot has to do with validations, right? So now that I've created this model, I can run validations using something called data annotations to make sure that if maybe we can put a requirement on it to make sure that it exists. We can put a length requirement on it. We can have like a data type to make sure that it's like a type datetime. Whatever validations we want, we can put on there. So we can go to our quote class and we can define all of our validations like so. Probably need to use data annotations. Cool. So if we take a look at the all the way down here into validations, there are a ton of different data annotations that we can use. Let's just do like required and min length for now. Let's just do this. Required, min length, I don't need this. And let's say 2. And let's do the same thing for contents. But let's say min length of 4. So now that we have these validations, before we actually save our quote to our database, we can check to see if our validations passed. And we can do that by running an if, I forget what it's called, if model state is valid, or I mean we have to try validation or something like that. What is it called? Try validate model. So try validate model new quote. So before we look at all of this stuff, what we're doing here is we've built a new quote object, right, using the quote class. And maybe the string of name that was passed in was 1 character, and maybe the string of content that was passed in was maybe 2 characters. both of those fail our validations, right? So this new quote object that we've built, this try validate model will go into our quote object and run all of these validations that we've set with data annotations. And it will create something called model state. So that's just saying, what is the state of this object? Is it valid or is it invalid, right? So we can say if model state dot is valid. So if I ran try validate model and I received this model state back and the attribute of is valid is true, if my model state is valid, then I can go ahead and do all of this, right? Else, what should I do? Maybe throw some errors back to the front end. Cool. So what another attribute of our model state is that if it's invalid, it's going to store in its .values attribute a list of all of the errors that were thrown back by data annotations. So viewback.errors equals model state.values, and then we will return view of index. Cool. Now in my view bag, I have a list of errors if this failed, so I can just loop through them using this handy for loop that we've given to you in our index. So it's just saying for each of the errors in our view bags, if there are any, then print them out. Cool. I think one last thing I'll need to do is make sure that I'm not trying to run a method on a null value, so I need to just create a list of empty strings. This is just so my code doesn't break. Oh my gosh. Cool. So close this out and restart it. Refresh my page. And let's see. So far so good. Try to submit. Cool. Getting some validations. The name field is required. The content field is required. If I type in this and maybe too short of a quote, the field content must be a string or array type with minimum length 4. So not a very descriptive error message, but kind of the default one it goes to. You can create your custom error messages. I think it's like an additional parameter in here where you're like errors. And then you can declare your error in here or something like that. I forget, but you can look it up. Cool. Awesome. So any questions so far about validating entries?
So yesterday, for my class, I could add in, I had like name, yada yada yada, but I could also add in messages as one, and then I could I would just be adding it and displaying via VBAG.
So are you talking about error messages for validations? Yeah. You can always create your custom validations by just using raw if else check.
I added a new parameter in my class called messages, which is where I stored it all in.
So in your like for future error messages?
Mm-hmm. So like under created or whatever I would have messages.
Yeah. Just you could definitely do that, but
for the test, is there one that you guys prefer, or like is this viewback? I mean, viewback.error is acceptable.
you would have to pass it through the VBag anyway. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what model state does for you, is that you don't have to do that. It auto generates that for you. If you want to create your custom errors, by all means do so. Yeah, using data annotations, you can create your own custom errors too. Data annotations. Let's read about that.
message.
Message, is it? Data annotations custom error message. Yeah, here. Error message. Yeah. So we could do in here. Yeah. So if this fails, hopefully we'll get this error message.
Cool.
I think. And then I have one last thing to show you guys before we close, which is using model binding, which is a whole other thing. Cool. We get this error message now. But one last thing I want to show you guys is something called model binding, and that has a lot to do with how C# maps. C# and a lot of the ORMs used with C# will do a lot of mapping for you in terms of like what you've given me. I'm going to search for something that's similar, and I'm going to pair these together, right? So we have in our index.cshtml, we have our names, name and content, that correspond coincidentally perfectly with our quote class, right? Name and content. So they're named exactly the same way. So instead of passing in the individual attributes of the object here, we can just pass in a type of quote, new quote. And what this will do is it will build your quote object for you, and 2, it will run try validate model for you. So not only will it just create the object, but it'll also run all of the validations for you just by passing it through the URL, because it will map all of these name attributes to the actual fields of your object or your class object. And if there is anything that doesn't match up, it'll throw the error at you, or it'll save it in the error state. So you can pretty much get rid of all of this code up here where we build the object and validate it. And everything should be good to go. Oops. So last, submit, cool. Where'd it go? And if we check our DB, there it is right there. Cool. So we covered a lot of stuff here. So hopefully if some stuff went over your head or some stuff wasn't clear, maybe rewatching the video, or better yet, rereading through some of the content that I kind of skimmed over, especially in the securing connection strings, because I'm sure this was probably the most confusing part for most people. It'll clear up what's happening. As far as your model binding goes and actually creating your object and validating them goes, it should be rather straightforward. If again you just refer back to the platform, it kind of gives you some great code snippets to look through. But any questions at this point?
Can you go back to the index?
Index.cshtml?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So at the very top,
Yeah.
you've got view data.
Uh-huh.
What is that?
I don't know. It probably has something to do with your layout.
You can.
View data.
Yeah.
Doesn't that change the
So
title?
yeah. So it will. Yes, whatever string that you've passed into view data title will be populated into your title in your layout.cshtml. Up here. So if I were to change this to...
Oh, is that how you change it depending on what page you're on?
Yeah, totally. So Monday. And if I refresh my page, it should say Hello Monday.
So can you show me where the changes made again in effect? So you
Just by setting you reset your view data title up here to this string, and then it'll just reset whatever it was back up here.
So we have two HTML files. One is the layout, and one is the actual. So one is actually just a template.
And it gets rendered into this statement.
Okay, I haven't seen this before.
So in render body we have index.html.
Yes. And above our index.html, we have all of this content, and below our index.html, we have all of this content.
So basically, the index CHTML is boring. Is using the layout as a base template, and then it fills in all the details as needed.
Yep. But it's important to note that it gets rendered right here on line 16. So what's below line 16? Our jQuery, right? So does that mean we have jQuery in index.cshtml? We don't.
Don't?
Nope. Even if we have a document.ready, we won't be able to run it. But if we just move this up here, we do. Does that make sense?
Would you put that in the head normally?
You can put it anywhere. It's just a script tag that you can kind of put anywhere you want. But for some reason, Candyman will default it to after your render body. Cool? All right, guys. That was a lot of content. It's almost lunchtime.